In 1872, the Ravenscroft estate, perched atop the mist-laden hills of Yorkshire, became a symbol of whispered terror and unfathomable mystery. Locals spoke in hushed tones of candlelit ceremonies that stretched far into the night, of symbols carved deep into stone walls and the anguished cries of unseen participants echoing through the manor halls. Servants, visitors, and passing travelers alike reported an unsettling presence, shadows that moved when no one was near, sudden cold drafts in sealed rooms, and an oppressive feeling that every step was being watched. Rumors proliferated. The family was said to dabble in forbidden rituals, a strange and troubling blend of devout religiosity, occult practice, and behaviors that outsiders labeled as madness. From the very beginning, contrasts emerged with haunting clarity. Publicly, the Ravenscrofts presented themselves as devout, aristocratic, and orderly. Privately, whispers suggested hidden depravity and ritualistic obsession. Innocence and corruption seemed to exist side by side, and law and superstition collided in ways the villagers could neither reconcile nor fully articulate. Eyewitness accounts and local gossip painted wildly divergent pictures. Some insisted the family were eccentric traditionalists, obsessed with maintaining rituals and decorum, harmless in their eccentricity, yet aloof in their wealth. Others argued they were sinister, orchestrating manipulations of human and spiritual forces beyond understanding, bending servants and visitors alike to unspoken wills. Even journalists who ventured into the hills were unsettled, their reports blending observed reality with the uncanny, unsure of what was fact and what was fear, conjured by imagination. The estate became a stage upon which both fascination and dread played out, a living paradox where curiosity intertwined with terror. The very geography of the place, the dense woodlands, narrow paths, and fog-choked valleys, seemed to conspire in concealing secrets, shaping the estate into a labyrinth not only of stone and timber, but of rumor, fear, and human imagination. The story of the Ravenscrofts challenges every boundary between reason and belief. Moral judgment clashed with secrecy, and human curiosity collided with acts that may forever be beyond comprehension. Those who approached the manor spoke of moments that defied explanation, shadows that lingered longer than the natural, whispered, voices that carried across empty halls, and feelings of unease that settled into the bones. Was this the work of ritual and occult knowledge? Or was it a reflection of the human mind's dark fascination with forbidden power? The answers remain, as obscured as the estate itself. In exploring the Ravenscrofts, we confront a tale where myth and reality entwine, where innocence and corruption intertwine, and where history and conscience are left unsettled. It is a narrative that evokes both intellectual intrigue and primal fear, forcing us to question the limits of morality, the power of secrecy, and the unsettling possibility that some acts, some knowledge, may exist just beyond human comprehension. The Ravenscroft's legacy lingers, still, a chilling echo of what may have occurred behind closed doors, a haunting story where the imagination must grapple with shadows that refuse to dissipate. The story of the Ravenscroft family begins long before the chilling events of 1872, rooted in the quiet rolling hills of Yorkshire during the early 1800s. They emerged into prominence through a combination of land acquisitions, mercantile ventures, and strategic marriages that cemented their social standing. Letters, estate ledgers, and personal diaries preserved within the family archives reveal a household meticulous in its appearance of order and propriety, yet deeply enmeshed in secrecy. Every corner of the estate, from the stone manor to the surrounding fields, was under the constant gaze of stewards, governesses, and matrons, who ensured that children adhered to the exacting standards expected of their class. These young Ravenscrofts were instructed, not merely in literature, mathematics, or etiquette, but in a strict moral code that emphasized obedience, discipline, and the appearance of virtue above all else. Observers who interacted with the family noted the peculiar intensity of the children's demeanor, an almost unsettling awareness that belied their age. Even in play, the Ravenscroft children were said to display precocious cunning, an ability to observe, calculate, and manipulate with disarming charm. Yet beneath this veneer of respectability lay a profound isolation. The estate, although grand, was nestled in a valley surrounded by dense woodlands and treacherous paths, making access difficult and fostering both privacy and suspicion. Neighbors recounted that the family rarely ventured into the nearby villages, and when they did, interactions were formal, often abrupt, leaving an impression of otherness that invited curiosity and fear. Folklore tied to the land itself predates the Ravenscrofts, with stories of pagan sites, ancient curses, and unexplained deaths whispered by farmers and woodsmen. It is perhaps in this mingling of isolation and inherited wealth that the seeds of rumor took root. Outsiders found the family enigmatic, their behaviors peculiar yet outwardly impeccable, a combination that would later lend credence to tales of sinister practice. From the earliest days, contrasts are stark. The outward appearance of refinement and morality versus the whispered suspicion of the unknown, the affluence that allowed privilege versus the isolation that fostered secrecy, the normalcy of domestic life against the anomaly of unexplained behaviors. Diaries from governesses and stewards offer rare glimpses into daily life at the Ravenscroft estate. They describe children who were intensely observant, who noted every conversation, every shift in expression, and who could, according to some accounts, predict behaviors before they occurred. These skills, while praised as intelligence and diligence, were also unsettling. Adults in the household and visiting scholars remarked upon a sense that the children's awareness extended beyond the ordinary, that they possessed a perception that bordered on the uncanny. Such observations, in an era that prized rationality yet simultaneously feared deviation from social norms, became fertile ground for speculation. Were these simply gifted children, products of strict education and attentive parenting, or was there something more, something inherently peculiar in their demeanor that unsettled both servants and visitors? The ambiguity was precisely what allowed the family's reputation to oscillate between admiration and fear. The household itself was structured, with rigid hierarchy and surveillance. Governesses maintained meticulous records of lessons and comportment, reporting daily on successes and failures. Stewards and matrons oversaw interactions, ensuring children did not step beyond the boundaries of propriety. Social visits were tightly controlled, and outsiders were admitted only under careful scrutiny, leaving few opportunities for observation beyond what the family allowed. Yet even in this controlled environment, anomalies were recorded. Servants spoke of children disappearing into shadowed corridors for hours, returning with strange knowledge or behavior unprompted by instruction. Letters hint at secretive conversations, held in the dead of night, of whispered plans and unexplained knowledge that unsettled even the most seasoned staff. Historians studying these records suggest that the combination of isolation, wealth, and tightly enforced hierarchy created conditions in which behaviors could be exaggerated, misinterpreted, or imbued with sinister meaning by those outside the family circle. Local folklore also played a crucial role in shaping the perception of the Ravenscrofts. Long before the family rose to prominence, the estate had been a locus of superstition. Farmers spoke of the land as watchful, claiming that strange lights appeared on the hilltops and that livestock sometimes refused to graze near certain groves. Curses, old family feuds, and tales of death without cause were woven into the cultural memory of the region. When the Ravenscrofts moved in and established themselves as the principal household, these pre-existing narratives intersected with their unusual behaviors, creating a complex web of fear, curiosity, and speculation. Outsiders could not separate the family from the land, nor the land from its legends. Every unexplained event, an illness in the household, an unexplained noise, a sudden disappearance, was filtered through a lens of folklore, amplifying its impact and embedding it in collective memory. The family's social position further complicated matters. Wealth and influence afforded them legal protections, deference from local authorities, and access to education and culture. Yet these privileges also heightened scrutiny. Any unusual behavior became newsworthy, any misstep exaggerated, and the slightest rumor of impropriety spread rapidly. Letters from visiting scholars describe conversations where the children's observations and questions unnerved adults, highlighting a precocity that blurred the lines between innocence and manipulation. One account recalls Ackles predicting a guest's response to a moral question with unnerving precision, leaving the adult unsettled and questioning whether the household nurtured intellect or something more troubling. Such moments, whether coincidental or deliberate, contributed to a sense that the Ravenscrofts operated according to codes hidden from ordinary society. The convergence of environment, privilege, and secrecy ultimately established a household that was both admired and feared. Publicly, the family exemplified refinement, education, and social responsibility. Privately, behaviors noted by staff, visitors, and diarists hinted at precocious cunning, unusual awareness, and perhaps a fascination with practices that defied societal norms. The contrast between admiration and suspicion, between the ordinary and the anomalous, set the stage for later events that would cement the Ravenscrofts' place in history as enigmatic and potentially sinister. Understanding these origins, how isolation, wealth, education, and folklore interacted, is crucial for decoding the rituals, legends, and accounts that would later define their notorious legacy. The story of the Ravenscrofts begins not with crime, but with a convergence of environment, inheritance, and secrecy, a convergence that allowed fear and fascination to take root and flourish across generations. By the 1860s, the Ravenscroft estate had become a locus of whispered speculation and quiet dread among the neighboring villages. Farmers returning from fields spoke in low tones of candlelight flickering late into the night, of distant chants that seemed to rise from the hills themselves. Servants newly hired to the household often hesitated to recount their experiences, but fragments of their testimony paint a picture both strange and unsettling. Some described being awakened by rhythmic sounds echoing through the halls, a mixture of chant, movement, and occasional cries that were neither wholly human nor easily identifiable. Others recalled the sudden appearance of animal remains arranged in meticulous geometric patterns in hidden chambers or on the frost-covered grounds outside. It was as though the very land had become a stage for acts that were intended to remain unseen, and yet could not be entirely hidden. The stories grew quickly as rumor and anecdote converged to create a narrative that was part truth, part imagination, and entirely haunting. The children of the household, already noted for their precocious intelligence and unyielding discipline, were reportedly forbidden from speaking of events that took place within the manor. Visits from outsiders, neighbors, tradesmen, and the occasional scholar revealed a striking contrast between the outwardly normal family and the eerie, regimented behavior of its younger members. Observers described them as quiet, almost unnervingly obedient, moving in synchronized patterns that suggested rehearsal rather than spontaneity. At once charming and intimidating, the children's conduct reinforced the perception that something hidden was being cultivated within the walls of the estate. Stories circulated of one child appearing at a window in the dead of night, silhouetted by flickering torchlight, raising questions that adults were not meant to answer. Questions about rights, about obedience, about the unseen forces shaping their lives. The line between innocence and indoctrination blurred, leaving villagers to wonder whether the Ravenscrofts were raising children or training initiates. Incidents began to accumulate with a disturbing regularity, fueling speculation that the estate was a place apart from ordinary life. Livestock vanished mysteriously, often in the middle of the night, leaving no trace beyond the occasional sign of struggle and the faint, lingering odor of smoke or incense. Servants reported illnesses that seemed to affect some, but not all members of the household, occurring during or immediately after late-night gatherings. Visitors occasionally claimed to see figures moving in synchronized patterns across the grounds, cloaked and silent, performing acts that were neither openly violent nor clearly ritualistic. The ambiguity was disorienting. What could be explained as eccentricity, strict discipline, or coincidence became, through repetition and the weight of rumor, something decidedly sinister. Neighbors debated endlessly. Were these the marks of eccentric aristocrats, criminally unhinged minds, or practitioners of forbidden rites that touched on realms beyond comprehension? Local authorities were drawn into the growing web of suspicion, though intervention was tempered by the family's wealth and influence. Magistrates and constables recorded initial complaints regarding disturbances, lost livestock, and unusual behavior by the children, yet they approached each report cautiously. Letters between village officials reflect an anxiety about challenging a household of considerable social standing. Accusations could provoke outrage, lawsuits, or social scandal. Investigations were often perfunctory, hindered by the estate's isolation, the controlled conduct of the family, and the natural reticence of servants who feared retaliation. As a result, early reports often remained unverified, leaving gaps that rumor and imagination filled with spectral detail. Villagers, aware that official confirmation might never arrive, began to interpret even minor events as signs of a deeper hidden reality. The social and cultural context of the time amplified fear. Victorian England held a complex relationship with superstition, morality, and rationality. On one hand, scientific progress and empirical observation were celebrated. On the other, anxieties about morality, social deviance, and the unknown were pervasive. Into this milieu entered the Ravenscrofts, a wealthy, isolated, and enigmatic family. Their unusual behaviors, when coupled with local legends of pagan practices and cursed land, created a narrative that seemed to confirm the villagers' worst suspicions. Observers interpreted unexplained sounds, sudden appearances, and cryptic conduct as evidence of practices that violated social and spiritual norms. The contrasts were pronounced. The outward appearance of normalcy versus the whispered knowledge of secret gatherings. The innocence of children versus the suggestion of indoctrination. The authority of law versus the omnipresence of secrecy. Each new story heightened collective anxiety, turning ordinary observation into legend. Psychologists, examining accounts from later years, interpret these early reports through the lens of human perception and memory. It is likely that suggestion, expectation, and fear magnified ordinary events. A child moving silently through a hallway, a lantern flickering in the wind, or a startled animal might be reconstructed in memory as evidence of ritualistic behavior. Yet even these analyses cannot account for the sheer consistency of reports across decades and observers. Servants who arrived at different times, villagers who observed from various vantage points, and itinerant workers all contributed overlapping descriptions of nocturnal gatherings, chanting, and strange formations with animal remains. The convergence of independent testimonies lends a haunting credibility to accounts, blurring the boundary between rational explanation and perceived reality. Rumors of occult practice also intertwined with documented incidents. Certain gatherings reportedly took place in Theminor's hidden chambers, where symbols were etched into stone walls and incense or strange liquids were employed. Outsiders described seeing figures moving in precise ritualistic patterns, sometimes accompanied by chanting that persisted for hours. These nocturnal occurrences were contrasted with the daytime image of an ordinary, even genteel family, attending church, hosting polite visitors, and managing the estate's affairs with diligence. The stark dichotomy between day and night, surface, and hidden depths, normalcy and transgression, fueled fascination as much as fear. The family's conduct invited interpretation, and interpretation in the absence of certainty became myth. As the decade progressed, the cumulative weight of incidents and speculation created a fertile environment for storytelling. Tales of animal disappearances, nocturnal gatherings, and cryptic symbols spread, shaped by the human tendency to fill in blanks with narrative. Each whispered account, each partial observation, added to the edifice of dread surrounding the Ravenscroft estate. The villagers' imagination, already steeped in the supernatural, worked in concert with factual oddities to create a story that could be neither wholly verified nor dismissed. It was in this environment that fear and curiosity intertwined, transforming rumor into legend. By the end of the 1860s, the Ravenscroft estate was no longer merely a residence. It had become a symbol of the unknown, a locus where innocence collided with secrecy, and where law, morality, and reason struggled to penetrate. The early incidents at Ravenscroft demonstrate the interplay of observation, imagination, and social context. Each event, disappearances of livestock, unexplained illness, fleeting glimpses of movement or whispered chants, was amplified by isolation, wealth, and the cultural lens of the era. Authorities approached cautiously, while locals filled in gaps with speculation. Children's behaviors, cryptic symbols, and secretive nighttime activity were interpreted through contrasting frameworks of fear and fascination. In this nexus, rumor became indistinguishable from reality, and the estate itself transformed into a canvas for human projection. Innocence and malevolence, law and secrecy, reality and imagination were entwined, creating a story that would persist long after the events themselves faded. The early whispers, anecdotes, and incidents at Ravenscroft thus laid the foundation for decades of fascination, dread, and unresolved speculation, establishing the estate as a site where ordinary understanding faltered and human curiosity and fear found their fullest expression. By the 1870s, the Ravenscroft estate had become a lightning rod for both fear and curiosity, a place where the known laws of observation seemed to clash with the unexplained. Physicians, magistrates, and scholars from surrounding counties traveled to Yorkshire to witness the estate firsthand or to collect reports from those who'd. Their goal was simple in theory, to understand the phenomena within empirical and rational frameworks. Yet, the deeper these men and women delved, the more complex and confounding the narrative became. Reports described nocturnal gatherings, strange markings etched into walls, cryptic diagrams drawn with substances whose composition remained uncertain, and inexplicable psychological effects on both servants and villagers. Those who entered the estate, or even approached its periphery, frequently described sensations that defied rational explanation: vertigo, a sudden chill, auditory hallucinations, and a sensation of being watched by unseen eyes. Each observation that could not be immediately explained became fodder for both scientific inquiry and supernatural speculation, intensifying the conflict between reason and fear. Physicians attempted to catalog the strange experiences according to the medical knowledge of the time. Some suggested that what outsiders interpreted as occult behavior was, in fact, the result of psychological manipulation or mass hysteria. Others hypothesized neurological conditions affecting the family, particularly the children, whose regimented behavior and cryptic conduct seemed both unnatural and rehearsed. These children, schooled in strict discipline from birth, exhibited uncanny composure under circumstances that would unnerve most adults, prompting speculation that the household had developed methods to influence perception and obedience in subtle but powerful ways. Letters between physicians reveal a fascination bordering on fear, as they debated whether the Ravenscrofts were natural prodigies of manipulation or had tapped into unknown psychological mechanisms. The contrast between observable behavior and the interpretations imposed upon it illustrates a central tension. Is what we witness truly evidence of malevolence, or merely a reflection of human inclination to fear the unfamiliar? Local magistrates, aware of the estate's influence and wealth, approached the investigation with both caution and incredulity. Reports from neighbors described figures moving in ritualistic patterns, lights flickering behind shuttered windows, and the sounds of chanting echoing across the hills at night. Some villagers insisted that entire sequences of action, from the arrangement of objects to the conduct of servants, followed an occult logic that was imperceptible to outsiders, yet meticulous in execution. Magistrates documented these claims, but in formal proceedings, they were often dismissed as superstition or exaggeration. Correspondence shows that even skeptical authorities could not fully reconcile the frequency and consistency of reports with rational explanations. The combination of repeated observations, independent witnesses, and the estate's isolation created a pressure cooker environment for interpretation. Were these acts the result of disciplined eccentricity or evidence of forces beyond comprehension? Folklorists and self-proclaimed occultists took the narrative in another direction. They collected stories from generations of villagers, piecing together a tapestry of local superstition and legend that predated the Ravenscrofts themselves. Tales of cursed land, pagan rituals, and spectral apparitions became intertwined with contemporary accounts of the family's behavior. Some suggested that the estate sat atop ancient ley lines, amplifying psychic energy and connecting the Ravenscrofts to powers hidden from ordinary perception. Others speculated that the family had discovered arcane knowledge preserved in manuscripts long concealed from public view, allowing them to manipulate minds, foresee events, or communicate with forces beyond the material world. To supporters of this interpretation, every unexplained occurrence, every pattern of lights, every sudden illness among servants, every vanished animal, was evidence of a coherent, albeit unfathomable practice. The contrast between scientific, Skepticism and mystical conviction was never more stark than in these debates, with each side claiming the moral and intellectual high ground. Newspapers of the period amplified the tension. Journalists reported on the estate with varying degrees of credulity, blending observed fact with hearsay and conjecture. Headlines warned of hypnotic influence, prophecy, and ritual, while correspondents interviewed both terrified villagers and those who had dared to witness events firsthand. Some articles portrayed the Ravenscrofts as eccentric yet harmless aristocrats, while others suggested that they were dangerous manipulators, capable of bending will and perception through unknown means. Letters to the editors reveal a public divided. Half demanded legal action or investigation, convinced of malevolent intent, while others insisted on restraint, fearing that misinterpretation of custom or eccentricity could unjustly condemn the family. The estate had become more than a household. It was a battleground for competing narratives, where fact, rumor, and imagination collided. Psychological theories of influence and perception emerged in response to the reports. Observers noted that prolonged exposure to the estate, its rituals, and its inhabitants seemed to affect memory, judgment, and emotional stability. Some argued that the family had honed techniques of subtle persuasion, inducing obedience or suggestibility in servants and visitors. Others posited that collective fear and expectation amplified the effect. A servant anticipating a supernatural encounter might misinterpret ordinary movement or sound as evidence of the occult. The interplay between suggestion, fear, and observation demonstrates how human cognition can amplify uncertainty, turning the ambiguous into the terrifying. Yet while modern psychology can account for some experiences, the uniformity and specificity of multiple independent accounts challenge simple explanations. Meanwhile, local clergy entered the debate, interpreting the events through theological lenses. Some viewed the estate as a site of moral corruption, a household perhaps in communion with evil forces. Sermons occasionally referenced the Ravenscrofts as cautionary examples of sin manifesting in behavior and environment. Priests debated whether ritualistic acts were intentional blasphemy, misguided devotion, or symbolic gestures whose meaning was obscured by fear and secrecy. Their interpretations added another layer of contrast: morality versus secrecy, spiritual authority versus worldly power, ethical judgment versus curiosity. The combination of rational, mystical, and moral frameworks created an intricate web of narrative that left observers perpetually uncertain. Reports of hypnotic influence, alleged prophecy, and inexplicable events continued to circulate. Visitors reported being compelled to follow unseen directives, experiencing visions or sudden realizations of danger. Villagers claimed that livestock behaved erratically when near the estate, that winds seemed to carry whispers, and that thievery topography contributed to a sense of disorientation. Each account, whether confirmed or speculative, reinforced the perception that the Ravenscrofts were engaged in practices outside ordinary comprehension. The contrast between empirical observation and mystical interpretation dominated discourse. Scientific minds sought to measure, quantify, and explain. Mystics and folklorists celebrated mystery, asserting that the family's actions touched on hidden truths and forbidden knowledge. By the end of the decade, the estate had achieved symbolic significance. It was no longer merely a household under scrutiny. It had become a canvas upon which collective anxieties, curiosity, and fear were projected. Rational investigation clashed with folklore, psychology intersected with superstition, and law attempted to assert authority over phenomena that defied comprehension. The Ravenscrofts embodied the tension between the known and unknown, the observable and the ineffable. Their practices, interpreted through multiple lenses, scientific, mystical, moral, ensured that the estate remained a site of fascination, dread, and debate. Every observation, rumor, and testimony reinforced the enigma. The estate was a crucible where reason struggled to reconcile with terror, morality contended with curiosity, and reality collided with imagination. The interplay of science, superstition, and the occult at Ravenscroft demonstrates the complexity of human understanding. Fear amplifies observation. Interpretation magnifies reality. The estate became a mirror reflecting not only the actions of a family but the anxieties, assumptions, and desires of an entire community. What began as reports of ritualistic activity evolved into debates spanning rational science, mystical speculation, and moral judgment. Through the lens of the Ravenscrofts, we observe the human struggle to comprehend what lies beyond ordinary experience, the friction between knowledge and belief, evidence and terror, observation and imagination. Each reported event became both a challenge to reason and an invitation to wonder, leaving the story unresolved and haunting those who dared to look too closely. The first whispers of the Ravenscroft household, when filtered through the voices of those who lived, labored, or merely passed nearby, create a tapestry of conflicting impressions, leaving no definitive image of the family. Servants' diaries reveal meticulous attention to duty and obedience, yet some entries betray unease, describing instructions that seemed arbitrary, ritualistic, or laced with implicit threat. A young maid, Anne Whitmore, who served at the estate during the early 1870s, wrote of evenings when the household fell into a peculiar silence, interrupted only by measured footsteps and the distant sound of a bell that rang with no discernible source. She described feeling watched even when alone, as though invisible eyes followed her through the halls. Yet in other passages, she noted moments of generosity from Lady Ravenscroft, who insisted on distributing clothing to local children and attending church services with solemn devotion. These contrasts, benevolence interlaced with fear, highlight the complexity of perception within the estate, where daily life could veer between warmth and terror depending on circumstance and perspective. Neighbors, too, contributed to the narrative, though their accounts were filtered through rumor and partial observation. Mr. Harold Fenwick, a tenant farmer whose land bordered the estate, reported seeing figures moving with ritualistic precision at night. Yet he also recalled instances when the Ravenscrofts aided the poor during harsh winters. He described observing children walking in silence, their eyes wide and alert, as if absorbing some invisible lesson. Fenwick's accounts oscillate between fear and respect, illustrating the tension that dominated local perception. The family was at once a symbol of authority and of dread. The reliability of these testimonies is difficult to ascertain. Details conflict, dates shift, and memories are inevitably colored by personal bias, cultural expectation, and social hierarchy. Yet the very contradictions illuminate the essence of the Ravenscroft enigma. They were capable of embodying multiple truths simultaneously, depending on who observed them and through what lens. Itinerant workers who pass through Yorkshire on seasonal labor contracts offer another layer of perspective. Their encounters were often brief, yet they provide vivid impressions of the estate's atmosphere. A traveling blacksmith named Thomas Greaves recounted arriving at the estate after dark to deliver repairs. He described hearing chanting, the flicker of torchlight through high windows, and the faint scent of herbs burned in unknown ceremonies. Greaves's account, written decades later, claimed that even the air within the estate felt thick and heavy, as though every breath demanded a secret toll. Psychological analysis might suggest that expectation, superstition, and the suggestibility of an unfamiliar environment influenced his interpretation. Yet multiple itinerant workers reported similar experiences, suggesting a consistency of atmosphere that was undeniable, even if its source remained ambiguous. The estate seemed to impose itself on consciousness, shaping perception as much as physical reality. Legal statements and court transcripts, preserved in local archives, provide yet another lens through which to view the Ravenscrofts. A case in 1875 involved a dispute over unpaid labor, during which testimonies included details of locked chambers, odd symbols carved into walls, and strange midnight gatherings. Witnesses described being compelled to perform tasks without full understanding of their purpose, sometimes observing the family at a distance while feeling a mixture of obligation and fear. One steward testified to seeing the family perform movements that appeared choreographed, almost hypnotic in precision, as if every gesture carried symbolic weight. Lawyers and magistrates, constrained by evidence and social deference to aristocracy, often dismissed these accounts as exaggeration or misinterpretation. Yet the meticulous consistency across independent reports lends weight to the idea that the household operated under rules and rhythms unfamiliar and unsettling to outsiders. Diaries of children raised within the estate offer perhaps the most intimate, though deeply conflicted perspective. They speak of lessons in decorum and religious observance, yet also hint at exercises that bordered on psychological coercion. One child, Edward Ravenscroft Jr., recorded a memory of being instructed to memorize sequences of symbols whose meaning was never explained, while another, Mary Ravenscroft, described late-night walks through the gardens under strict supervision, where silence was enforced and the air carried the scent of incense. Psychologists analyzing these testimonies centuries later suggest that early exposure to regimented secrecy, combined with ritualized instruction, could imprint deep psychological influence, shaping perception, obedience, and memory. The children's narratives are fragmented, often contradictory, yet they share a persistent thread. The estate was a place of extraordinary discipline, of experiences both formative and disturbing, where fear and expectation intertwined with daily life. The interplay of observation and interpretation extends to symbolic and architectural details within the estate. Witnesses repeatedly describe hidden chambers, narrow passages behind bookshelves, and carved emblems whose meaning was opaque. Some servants claim that certain rooms were forbidden, yet even being near them produced a sense of unease, a visceral reaction that could not easily be explained. Outsiders often misinterpreted these features as evidence of occult ritual, while scholars might describe them as manifestations of control and hierarchy. The contrast between perception and reality becomes central. The estate's physical and symbolic structures exerted influence on those who entered, regardless of whether any supernatural element was present. Fear and expectation transformed ordinary architecture into sites of mystery and dread. Accounts of nighttime processions and ceremonial activity are among the most unsettling. Servants described moving in silence, following precise routes through hallways and gardens, sometimes carrying objects whose function was unknown. Villagers occasionally glimpsed shadows through high windows, interpreted as rituals or secret meetings. Such events, reported independently by multiple observers, suggest a deliberate orchestration of sight and sound, of experience and perception. Whether intended to instill fear, maintain secrecy, or transmit knowledge, these actions created an environment where ordinary observation could not fully capture meaning. The contrast between visible action and hidden intent highlights the enduring ambiguity of the Ravenscroft legacy. Even philanthropic gestures by the family were refracted through layers of perception and interpretation. While the Ravenscrofts occasionally hosted charitable dinners, provided gifts, or assisted the local parish, these acts were often viewed with suspicion. Observers questioned motive and sincerity, suggesting that generosity could be performative, a mechanism for social control, or a veil for darker inclinations. The interplay of public virtue and private secrecy mirrors the tension found in other testimonies. Appearances seldom matched perception, and perception was always conditioned by fear, expectation, and prior narrative. Each witness account, no matter how benign, is therefore a prism reflecting multiple possible truths. Historians and psychologists analyzing these testimonies centuries later emphasize the role of bias, trauma, and social position. Servants may have exaggerated out of fear or resentment. Neighbors may have misinterpreted behavior through the lens of class anxiety. Children may have recorded experience in fragmented symbolic memory. Yet the cumulative weight of independent accounts produces a portrait that is coherent in theme, if not in precise detail. The Ravenscrofts' household emerges as a space where fear and fascination coexist, where every action can be interpreted as benign, malevolent, or supernatural depending on perspective. Memory, imagination, and moral judgment intertwine, creating narratives that endure far beyond the temporal bounds of daily life. Ultimately, the witness accounts and testimonies of the Ravenscroft estate illustrate a fundamental truth about human experience. Perception is never objective, and memory is never neutral. In the case of the Ravenscrofts, the complexity of household dynamics, the secrecy imposed by hierarchy, and the aura of fear surrounding their activities transformed ordinary observation into a layered, often contradictory record. Fear magnified small anomalies, expectation shaped perception, and moral judgment colored every report. The estate thus becomes both a historical subject and a locus of fascination, a site where reality and interpretation coexist in perpetual tension. The stories passed down through generations preserve the echo of lives lived under extraordinary circumstances, and they ensure that the enigma of the Ravenscrofts remains unresolved, haunting all who attempt to reconcile witness perception with historical fact. Even decades later, scholars examining letters, diaries, and legal statements continue to debate the credibility of specific events. Were hidden chambers used for ritual or simply for privacy? Were nighttime processions intended to intimidate, instruct, or commemorate? Each question underscores the central tension. In the absence of definitive evidence, human imagination fills gaps, and every account becomes a mixture of observation, interpretation, and projection. The interplay between personal experience and collective narrative amplifies the mystique, cementing the Ravenscrofts in history as both feared and admired, condemned and revered. The Ravenscroft estate has long been a magnet for speculation, the focal point of debates that stretch across decades, disciplines, and imagination itself. From the very first rumors whispered among villagers to the carefully documented diaries of those who lived and worked within the estate, the practices and behaviors of the family have never been fully understood. Some theorists argue that the rituals, secret chambers, and midnight processions were merely the trappings of criminal activity concealed by wealth and social standing. They suggest that coercion, manipulation, and psychological control were exercised as mechanisms of dominance over servants and local residents, a way to enforce obedience and cultivate fear without ever stepping into the legal spotlight. The argument is compelling. Wealth, isolation, and rigid hierarchy provide both motive and opportunity, allowing actions that would provoke outrage if exposed to public scrutiny to remain unseen. Yet alongside this rationalist interpretation, there exists a countercurrent, one that embraces the supernatural, the mystical, and the unknowable. Occultists and folklorists argue that the Ravenscrofts were more than mere aristocrats exploiting power. They were practitioners of esoteric knowledge, custodians of rituals whose meaning has been lost to time. Reports of hypnotic influence, whispered prophecies, and symbolic carvings in obscure locations suggest a family deeply immersed in traditions that merged faith, ritual, and psychological performance. Some insist that the estate itself held an energy, a lingering presence, a force that shaped behavior and perception alike. Witnesses consistently describe the estate as oppressive, almost sentient, a space where rational explanation falters and imagination takes hold. The contrast is stark. Reason versus myth, evidence versus aura, the tangible versus the ineffable. Anthropologists have examined the estate through the lens of social hierarchy and ritualized behavior. They note that ceremonies, processions, and observances, even when opaque to outsiders, often serve functions of cohesion, discipline, and social signaling within isolated communities. From this perspective, the Ravenscroft rituals could represent a complex system of control and education, an internalized code meant to regulate behavior and transmit cultural values, however extreme or distorted. The patterns of movement, repetition, and symbolic display might reflect an exaggerated form of household order, intensified by wealth and seclusion, rather than inherently malevolent or mystical intent. Yet even anthropologists acknowledge the potency of perception. The rituals, when observed from outside the family, took on a life of their own, becoming spectacles interpreted as sinister, supernatural, or morally corrupt. Psychologists, meanwhile, focus on the human dimension, manipulation, coercion, and the cultivation of fear. Servants and children within the estate often reported experiencing anxiety, obedience enforced through subtle psychological mechanisms, and a constant awareness of observation. Diaries and letters suggest that even minor infractions could result in sudden, unexplained punishment, creating a climate of heightened sensitivity and hypervigilance. Modern interpretations frame this as an early case study in the effects of psychological dominance, social isolation, and ritualized control on vulnerable individuals. Yet the very act of analyzing behavior through a clinical lens cannot strip the estate of its eerie, almost mythical resonance. Observation and interpretation coexist in tension, leaving room for both rational explanation and lingering dread. Folklorists emphasize the narrative dimension, exploring how stories of the state evolved over time. Each retelling, from the earliest villagers' whispers to modern internet forums, transforms observation into legend, amplifying fear and fascination. Tales of candlelit ceremonies, moving shadows, and symbolic carvings become motifs repeated across accounts, blending fact and embellishment. This process illustrates the human need to make sense of the unknown, to project moral judgments onto behaviors that are opaque or socially transgressive. The estate becomes a canvas upon which imagination, anxiety, and morality are projected, ensuring that each generation encounters a story both thrilling and unsettling, half rooted in history, half born of collective speculation. Legal and historical. Researchers continue to puzzle over gaps in documentation. While estate records, diaries, and property accounts provide glimpses into daily life, significant periods remain opaque, leaving crucial questions unanswered. Were the midnight processions pedagogical, ceremonial, or coercive? Were animal remains used symbolically, ritually, or for practical purposes unknown to observers? Each unanswered question magnifies the aura of mystery, allowing theorists to impose interpretations that range from rationalist to fantastical. Historians acknowledge that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, a principle that ensures the Ravenscroft legacy continues to resist definitive categorization. The estate also became a locus for debates about morality, power, and social norms. Observers ask whether the family's actions were abusive or simply eccentric, criminal or traditional. Contrasts abound: innocence versus corruption, privilege versus exploitation, secrecy versus accountability. Even philanthropic gestures are refracted through suspicion, seen alternately as sincere charity or calculated display. Each layer of interpretation highlights the difficulty of untangling motive from perception, fact from myth. The estate, in Nietzsche's essence, operates as a mirror, reflecting human anxiety about authority, secrecy, and the limits of understanding. Modern fascination with the Ravenscrofts is amplified by media and literature. Novels, journalistic essays, and online forums revisit the estate, often blending archival research with speculative narrative. Each iteration perpetuates the legend, reinforcing the duality at the heart of the mystery. The family is both historical subject and enduring myth. Anthropologists, psychologists, and folklorists all engage with the story, but none can fully resolve it, and that ambiguity is precisely what sustains interest. The estate functions as a case study in the human desire to probe the forbidden, to understand what defies ordinary explanation, and to grapple with the tension between fear and fascination. Ultimately, the Ravenscroft estate challenges our perception of truth. Rational analysis provides partial insight, but the combination of secrecy, ritual, psychological influence, and cultural projection ensures that the story resists finality. Scholars can debate motive, method, and impact, yet the narrative retains its chilling edge, fueled by unanswered questions and persistent anomalies. Observers are confronted with a space where morality, power, and imagination intersect, leaving them to ask, was the estate the site of calculated control, mystical communion, or a convergence of both? The ambiguity is inseparable from the story itself, ensuring that the Ravenscroft's legacy continues to haunt, provoke, and inspire generations. The fascination endures because human curiosity thrives in the unresolved. We seek to explain, to categorize, to tame fear with logic, but the Ravenscroft narrative offers resistance. Each account, each rumor, each fragment of evidence reminds us that secrecy can be both literal and psychological, that the absence of clarity can inspire awe as easily as terror. The estate, its rituals, and the family remain a nexus of contradiction. Rationality versus imagination, innocence versus influence, transparency versus obscurity. Scholars, enthusiasts, and casual observers alike are drawn into a web of speculation that refuses resolution, illustrating the enduring power of mystery. In the final analysis, Ravenscroft is a study in enduring mystique, a reminder that human fascination often thrives not in certainty, but in the gaps between observation and understanding. The estate, the family, and their rituals continue to provoke thought, debate, and unease, leaving all who study them with a haunting realization. Some truths may never be fully known, and some mysteries are meant to remain unresolved, lingering in the shadow of history, imagination, and fear. The Ravenscroft estate remains an enduring enigma, its legacy woven from shadows, whispers, and unanswered questions. Generations of observers have attempted to decipher the truth hidden behind its stone walls, yet every answer seems only to deepen the mystery. Reports of candlelit rituals, strange symbols etched into doors and walls, and the occasional disappearance of both animals and servants create a chilling tapestry where fact, fear, and imagination intertwine. Each account carries its own weight of credibility and suspicion, leaving no single narrative to dominate. Some insist that the Ravenscrofts were deliberate manipulators, employing psychological control, coercion, and ritualized intimidation to assert dominance over those around them. Others contend that ordinary behaviors, amplified by rumor and local superstition, were transformed into legends of terror, a projection of community anxieties onto a secluded aristocratic household. Still, a faction believes the estate itself may have been a conduit for forces beyond human comprehension, a place where the natural and supernatural converged to shape perception and behavior alike. The contrasts at Ravenscroft are what render it so haunting. Innocence and corruption, rationality and mysticism, visibility and secrecy exist simultaneously, each magnifying the other. Servants who obeyed orders without question might have been pawns of a calculated system, or participants in ceremonies whose meaning was never fully revealed. Observers from neighboring villages interpreted shadows and noises according to their own fears, some seeing malevolent intent, others merely eccentricity. Even historians and psychologists struggle to reconcile evidence with interpretation, and the estate has become a mirror, reflecting our deepest anxieties about power, morality, and the unknown. Attempts to classify the Ravenscroft's actions, according to law, psychology, or anthropology, reveal only the limits of human understanding, illustrating how mystery persists when observation collides with secrecy. Ravenscroft's silence is its most formidable weapon. Rooms that once echoed with ritualistic chanting now sit empty, cold and still, yet the resonance of past deeds lingers in stories passed down, in the uneven stonework of its halls, and in the imagination of all who study it. Cultural memory preserves the estate not as it truly was, but as a projection of fascination, fear, and the unknowable. Writers, journalists, and online commentators continue to debate what transpired, each interpretation both illuminating and obscuring the truth. The estate becomes more than a physical space. It is a conceptual locus for unresolved horror, a stage upon which humanity's struggle to reconcile morality, curiosity, and dread is continuously enacted. Ultimately, Ravenscroft defies finality. No theory fully satisfies. No account, completely, resolves the tension between what was observed, what was imagined, and what may have been. The estate challenges the boundaries of understanding, inviting reflection on how secrecy, power, and fear shape human perception. Its legends persist because they occupy the liminal space between knowledge and speculation, reality and myth, light and shadow. And so, the Ravenscroft estate endures, haunting, unresolved, and infinitely compelling, leaving one chilling question for posterity. What truly occurred behind its walls, and how much will remain forever beyond our grasp? Hidden in the darkness of history, imagination, and human fear,